Hi there, guys. So today I'm going to set out why I think so many people in this country feel so angry about immigration. So I'm going to set out 7 specific reasons which I think contribute to that feeling of anger and upset towards immigrants. So number 1, geography and demographics. Why is it that the places with the least amount of immigration often feel the most strongly about it? So I think that this is in part due to young people and graduates moving away from our towns and villages into our cities. So it's been called the brain drain, sort of a bit disparagingly. But essentially what tends to happen is that you end up with a concentration of older, perhaps more reactionary people in our towns and villages. And then in cities and urban areas, you have a younger, perhaps more diverse population. So the average age of people in Manchester is 31, whereas the average age of people in Blackpool is 43. So what that means then for immigration is that sometimes, as the old expression goes, sunlight is the best disinfectant. People in cities and urban areas, they tend to live cheek by jowl with migrants and non-white people. So perhaps they might not see them as a threat, and they may be partners, neighbours or colleagues. And linked to that then, there might not be that fear factor. And, generally, cities, they tend to be the economic hubs in our society. So there won't necessarily be that feeling of scarcity or post-industrial decline, which defines so many of our towns and which can lead people to feel upset about immigration due to their own economic situation. Linked to that then, if immigration across the country is generally going up, people who live in mostly white areas will notice changes more readily. And that can then cause upset or rancour because we've been conditioned to see non-white people as a threat, as a competition for jobs or as a drain on resources. So with all that being said, it's not actually a uniform picture. If you have to remember that we've had race riots in cities like Leicester and in large towns like Bradford before, but the overall picture remains, as I've said. So number 2, struggles with housing and the cost of living pressures. So immigration can be a real reminder of your own struggles, because if you see a family that don't look like you in social housing, for example, it can create a feeling of resentment. It can leave you feeling that people are getting things, perhaps when they haven't sufficiently paid in, or as Johnny-come-latelys. And that's particularly the case, or it's felt most keenly, if your rent is going up every year, if you're on the waiting list for social housing, or if your wages are flatlining, and when your bills are going up. It contributes to that feeling that other people are getting preferential treatment, that other people are getting things that you're not. So we've had a long line of this sort of thinking in recent history. So we had the moral panic in the 90s about single mums getting council houses. And I think this is another sort of version of that. And it's particularly prominent during times of scarcity and when times are tough. So, at the moment, we've got the cost of living crisis, which is absolutely crippling so many individuals and families. So again, just these day-to-day pressures, they can cause that sort of feeling of resentment and anger towards immigrants. So number 3, we have the failure of our economy. Our entire economic model is predicated on insecure, low-paid work. And Emmanuel Macron, he made this point recently when he talked about how the UK's economic model is a huge pull for migrants, obviously coming from France into the UK. So typically our type of economic model and the jobs market within that, it lends itself to high immigration, because when you've got a workforce made up of low paid people and immigrants who don't have many employment rights or much power, then what you've got is a supine, agile workforce that is just absolutely perfect for the needs of business. And we always have to remember that big business wants high immigration for those very reasons. Linked to that, we've also failed to train our own people or people born in this country consistently. And so we have huge skills gaps in our economy that we need immigration to fill. So that's again a failure of politics and economics. So individually, people born in Britain, they might feel undertrained or that their job is not worthwhile or well paid. And then they see the government importing large quantities of labour from abroad, potentially creating competition for wages and again for houses and other essential services. And again, that creates a feeling of resentment and anger. Number 4, political promises and failures. So this has been a constant drumbeat since, maybe 1997, probably before then actually. But certainly within the newspapers and media and within politics itself, Now, throughout that time, the politicians, they've always made promises about reducing immigration while simultaneously increasing it. So it's such a cynical sort of approach that they've taken. And it seems to be whichever party's in power, they've always played along with this notion that immigration is too high and they need to crack down on it. But a lot of the time, that's just for short-term political expediency. Think of the Tories. They said they were going to get immigration down to the tens of thousands, and it went up to like 800,000. So it's just a ludicrous sort of situation to be in, and short-term political expediency sort of trumps sensible policy making. I think linked to this, so the politicians, they've just refused to wean themselves off immigration as a route to quick economic growth, and because they need to keep the bosses, and the capitalist class happy. There are things that politicians could do to reduce immigration in the long term. Obviously they train people who were born in this country to fill the skills gap that we've got, or they could institute an economic model which led to increased pay for people, or they could encourage people into areas where we've got skills gaps, like care work or like fruit picking, with increased pay. But no, they just prefer to scapegoat the immigrants while simultaneously bringing them in to do these jobs. So, as I say, it's just been repeated failure for over 30 years. And that's, again, contributes to this feeling of anger and resentment that people have towards immigrants. 5, how we manage undocumented asylum seekers. So you think about it, we've devised a system in this country where it can take up to 3 years to decide on someone's asylum application. During that time, those people, they can't work and they need to be accommodated at high cost to the state. And because of the nature of our society, the way that housing is distributed, the spread of good quality, high value housing and then cheap quality, poor value housing, these asylum seekers are being parachuted into often deprived areas, perhaps old mill towns or areas where there's deindustrial decline. So whether they're living in hotels or in HMOs, they're being put into areas where anti-immigration sentiment is already high, and for the reasons that I set out earlier. And that is just an absolute recipe for disaster. And again, it increases anger and resentment. Number 6, manufactured consent. So by presenting immigration in a particular way, the mainstream media in this country help the establishment to use it as a sort of lightning rod and or a distraction for many of the other political issues and problems that we've got. So a good example of the way that media can sort of shape the narrative is that concern about immigration declined after the 2016 Brexit referendum. And that's because it fell off the front pages when we needed to sort of show that we were taking back control and that we'd gained control of our borders. But then interestingly, it rose in importance again from sort of late 2022 up until now. And particularly when the Tories were struggling and when they needed a distraction from their failures on the economy. And again, at that point, immigration became the most important issue. So it's just interesting that the media and the political class, they can frame the debate in this country and they can concentrate on particular issues at particular times for political expediency. And then more broadly, the role of the asylum seeker in the media. The asylum seeker's there to be a lightning rod for all of our problems. So, for example, they seek to blame immigration for housing shortages or for why you can't get an NHS appointment. And that then reduces people's capacity to see that housing shortages or NHS underfunding are systemic issues to do with our economy, and that they could be resolved, with a different policy outlook or just by having some vague political competence. And then that leads us into a wider point, which is that immigration helps the establishment to distract the population from the way that our society is structured and where power lies. The politicians and the media, they can claim that they don't have the power to change things in this country because whoever the European Union or the EHCR is preventing them from doing things. That was a well-trodden path during the Brexit referendum, which overlooks the fact that that most migration is legal migration and that we want huge numbers of immigrants because of our economic model, as I set out before. Number 7, just good old-fashioned racism. I purposely left this till last because I don't believe that people are inherently racist. People are not born racist. It comes about for the many reasons that I've outlined before. And in truth, I think there are actually only a very small number of people who think like this. Unfortunately, some of these people have got very large social media followings, so it can feel like they're sort of super popular or that these ideas are sort of mainstream. But the reality is that most people don't think like this. General polling shows that this isn't the case, and that it's a mixed picture in terms of immigration overall and the benefits of immigration. My overall sort of assessment of it is that there's a very vocal minority who have their voices amplified by social media and by sort of powerful figures such as Elon Musk, but actually they don't represent the vast majority of people in this country. So to end on a little bit of a positive note, there are lots of reasons why people feel angry and upset about immigration or about immigrants in their community, but we shouldn't let the media's portrayal of the situation colour our judgment. That's my view on why immigration is sort of at the top of people's concerns at the moment. What do you think? Have I missed anything? Have I left anything out? Please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.